Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is Mubarakah, and I want to welcome you to our first episode of the Fit Muslimah Podcast. The Fit Muslimah Podcast is developed to help you to be educated, motivated, and informed on how you can eat and move to optimize your body. I'm so excited for our episode today because we have a treat. One of my favorite doctors that I personally follow on Facebook, and we're going to talk about health, wellness, and how food incorporates into all of that and how it can shift the paradigm of health. So I am so excited that today we are talking to Dr. Hassina Kajee, and I want to welcome her to the show. Assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you so much for inviting me onto your show.
I am so excited because I think that it is such a treat to, number one, have a doctor who's here to really talk about the science, the nutrition, the facts around health and healing. And also too, it is wonderful. I'm going to be honest. I could be honest here on this podcast, right? I was so excited to find another hijabi Muslim doctor that vibed with me and talked on my level. And so I was super excited. I was like, I have to have her on my podcast. So after I stalked you for a little while, I finally reached out, and I was so excited that you agreed to be on the podcast. So before we get started, I want to tell people a little bit about your background. So Dr. Kajee is an integrative specialist physician with a obesity and preventive medicine. She left her dream job as the head of high care unit at the local university teaching hospital in order to find a way to prevent and decrease the huge number of patients reaching the hospital with diseases of lifestyle and obesity. She joined forces with the team at the Noakes Foundation, with whom she co-founded Eat Better South Africa, an NGO that educates under-resourced communities to make healthier lifestyle choices. She is currently the medical director of Eat Better South Africa. She is also the co-founder and medical curriculum director of Nutrition Network, an online education platform that educates and certifies healthcare practitioners in the science of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, and also trains and certifies nutrition advisors. Dr. Hassina runs a private practice and, alhamdulillah, is happily married mom and teacher of 2 real low-carb kiddies. So we have a lot to talk about because all of those things are absolutely fascinating to me, right? So it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. For me, it's fascinating because I think that your story as a doctor on how you began to just become aware of the fact that people's food choices was really affecting their health, and it wasn't just about treating them. So could you tell us a little bit about kind of like your journey in medicine and where you started, and what was that aha moment that made you make the shift?
So I think I, like most medical doctors, I've been very traditionally trained. The usual university training, and you literally just on this ladder and try, and it's your dream to reach that end point of being a doctor. And I was very blessed to have a granny. Alhamdulillah, she lived until the age of 95. She passed away last year, and she was very holistic. And for example, when we got cuts, she would put turmeric in our cuts, and we got the ginger and the turmeric and honey. And so I was exposed to 2 different ends of medicine and healing. And eventually reaching what I thought was my dream job, a job I never expected and seemed to just be placed in my lap, alhamdulillah. And it was heading up the high care unit of a department I was so happy to finally be able to work in full time, only to be faced day after day with things that were so preventable. Not only that, but the ages of the patients that I was seeing was just getting younger, and they were getting younger and younger. So we were having heart attacks coming in before the age of 30, and it was becoming common to see somebody coming in at the age of 20 something with chest pain and go, okay, let's do an ECG, simply because the person was overweight or a smoker. There was one particular day I ran a 10-bed unit, and on that particular day, all 10 beds were filled with cardiac patients, all potentially preventable due to nutrition. So the history of South Africa is that we have a very mixed background. So we've got people of sort of African origin, and then we've got people of European ancestry, and then we've got the mixed ancestry. And it's like the culture and the food, they're different. It's not only the traditional meals, like the African population eat a maize meal that is a staple. With a meat-based product, which isn't actually the ancestral diet of the region. But on top of that is now eating the modern industrial diet of the processed sugars and the fats. And so you can see why it is that people were getting sicker longer. If you look at the staff that I worked with, nurses, for example, waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes much earlier, leaving home, not seeing their children, working a 12-hour shift, getting home without time to prepare meals. And that is the type of environment that I was exposed to. When I became aware of low carbohydrate diets and looked into the science of it, initially I cannot prescribe something unless I've tried it myself. So I first, for a year, tried it on myself, tried it on my husband, who had struggled to lose weight. He was about 30 kilos overweight. And literally within 2 months or so, he had lost most of his weight, just like that, effortlessly. And I felt this burst of energy. It was always a question to me, the human being, we're so intelligent. There's so much intelligence in the human sort of physiology and anatomy. There's just this one thing. Why do we have to stop for meals so frequently? Why is it that when lunchtime comes, everything stops? Don't give me another patient. Don't talk to me. I need to refuel. And by eating this way, I suddenly was sometimes not even eating in the morning because I had no need to eat. I wasn't hungry. And eating once a day, but mostly eating twice a day. And so it was looking into the science, and it just made sense. Of course, a diabetic needs carbohydrate restriction. When your body gets to the point where your endogenous production of insulin isn't sufficient, but the science that you have a chronic disease have been there for more than 10 years, you noticed those little bumps popping up on your neck. You noticed the darkening of the skin. You noticed that you were going up in size in clothes year after year. That doesn't happen in the animal kingdom. Animals lose muscle mass as they age, so they get thinner. Human beings increase. So all of that, and then, introducing the concepts into my practice in a high care unit, seeing my nursing sisters take on that advice and reverse obesity in themselves and in their own families. I then started to implement it. I added on a clinic where I would take the patients that were admitted into the high care unit and see them after they had been discharged, see them in a clinic and started to implement these interventions in those patients. And then I was in this very funny position where I could either spend 95% of my time treating end-stage disease, basically standing at the cliff edge and kind of grabbing kind of 1% of the patients and reaching them, or I could do something where I was meeting them and their children and, way before they ever saw a need to get into the hospital at all. So it was a devastating experience, but I'm so appreciative for having experienced that, because it really pushed me into the need to just leave that. That was there to fuel my why, and then step into the space and try and figure out a way to practice preventative medicine.
So what was one of the interesting things that I always am fascinating with when people shift their focus or they shift their mission was there a particular aha moment or a light bulb moment where you decided on that shift? Was there a particular thing that made you say, okay, it's time to shift focus?
I think it was a series of little moments. I was pregnant with my second child. And when he was born, I noticed that he looked like my husband in terms of the way he was shaped. And at the same time, I realized my husband has a very strong family history of cardiac disease. His father had his first heart attack in his probably late 20s, early 30s, so very high risk. And my husband struggled with losing weight. Alhamdulillah, now at ideal body weight for his height, which happened, as I said, almost effortlessly. And it was realizing that I was going to try and do the best for my children. In any case, when my daughter was born 2.5 years before that, we were a pretty healthy family, refined, sugar-free, all of those things. But I realized that I needed to make that change for my family. At the same time, it was seeing, I remember clearly being in the emergency unit in the resus bay, being called to come and admit a patient into my unit from the emergency unit. He was a man in his 40s, morbidly obese, and he had a hole in his back from an abscess. And I remember distinctly putting my hand, when I was assessing him, I literally had to put my gloved hand into the hole to examine how deep that wound went, whether it had already gone into his lung space, which would have been a totally different story. And I remember standing there so demoralized and demotivated, having already walked the path where during my maternity leave, I had met the folks from the Noakes Foundation. It had just, the CEO, Jane Boulin, had just been appointed. And I had reached out to Prof. Noakes and said, this is perceived as a rich man's diet. We need to do something to bring this to poorer communities, because the public healthcare system where I was based and practicing were poorer patients with fewer resources, economic resources. And during my maternity leave, I had this time freed up to be able to look into options like this. And this was when we met and co-founded Eat Better South Africa. I remember standing in front. All this time, I would be talking to my patients and imploring them to make the change, talking to them about nutrition and all the importance. All of a sudden, I was put in touch with a group of 40 predominantly women, and there were 2 males in the group. And this group was sitting there wide-eyed, so excited, wanting to hear from us how they can change their lives. When I saw that hope was possible, that the community was reaching out, that was it. Yeah, I was in tears actually in that moment. It still gives me goosebumps standing there, realizing the potential. We ran the first intervention, and the winner of the intervention within 5 weeks had lost about 11 kilos. I don't know how much that is. You can do the
So
pound
it's
chart.
around about 25 pounds.
Yeah. And that is eating a basic, not, no almond flours and coconut flours. It's literally offal, chicken, fish, cabbage, gem squash, vegetables, in a community that doesn't have a lot of money to spend on food. And when I saw that this was possible, so all of a sudden I had one foot here where I'm in a community and these people they're just doing the right thing. They're practicing intelligent living. And here I am on the other end of the spectrum, signing death certificates of people who are desperate at that time in their life, young wives, sometimes pregnant, coming in with little children. What's in the child's hand? A packet of crisps and a cool drink. And I'm talking to the wife saying, listen, your husband's had a really serious heart attack. His heart function is now at 6%. This means that he's unlikely, he's not going to be able to do the work that he was doing. All of a sudden, their lives have drastically changed overnight. So here I was with the answer and a massive problem. And I was in a position where, because of the work that I had signed up for, I was forced to put my energy into that emergency unit where I had to help those patients. So whatever little time I had, I was trying to shunt, and it didn't work. I was burning the candle at both ends, and it wasn't a productive solution. And I think it was just the realization, seeing the possibility and the solution, and then seeing the problem and realizing that I really couldn't straddle both at the same time. I wish I could, but I really couldn't. And I had to just make the decision, spoke to my husband, said, listen, this isn't working. And together as a family, we made the decision that I would stop, take some time to figure out the direction. And, that's the way it went from there.
And so the question I think that a lot of people would have is, why low carb? Why didn't you go the traditional, here in the United States, low carb is still considered on the fringes. It's not a lot of doctors who specialize in therapeutic low carb, even though it's extremely effective. Why didn't you go the traditional kind of like, hey, eat low fat, whole grain, kind of like, why didn't you go that traditional method? And what was it that made you go the low carb, high fat way, as opposed to the traditional, what most people teach?
So a couple of reasons. Number one, you don't find low fat cows running around. So that's what I say to my patients. I say, where is the low fat cattle farm? Okay, it just didn't make sense to me. Why are we taking nature's milk and deciding that we know better and that we need to strain the fat and then add more carbohydrates to it, and now it's supposedly healthy? So firstly, that didn't make sense to me. Secondly, I tried the low fat. We ate what was suggested, and it was horrendous. It didn't work for me. I didn't know at the time. I never, thankfully, was overweight, but it didn't work for me. Funny enough, when I was pregnant with my daughter, eating that way, I was on the way to developing gestational diabetes towards the very end, even though I hadn't really gained a lot of weight. I also have that family history of diabetes. So that was the one thing that I noticed from child number one. It took me about a year and a half to get my pre-baby body back, in terms of being able to run and just feeling like I'm myself again. Whereas with son, it took me 6 weeks to get my body back, to feel I'm me. My tummy feels, like strong, and all the baby fat's gone. So that was one thing. Eating low fat, like I said, it just didn't make sense. I would eat a breakfast, the whatever health porridge or whatever it was, or muesli, and I would be starving by 11 o'clock. And then I would be starving again by 2 o'clock, and I would be starving again by 5 o'clock. And it just did not make any sense to me. And so when I went into the history and read about the science and read about how people used to eat, this idea of who came up with this idea of eating every few hours and having small snacks in between. Nobody eats like that. Traditionally, ancestrally, people used to eat once a day or at most twice a day.
Right.
So for me, it was a common sense decision. Also, when you look into the various trials that were done where people were put on a very low fat diet, you see that low fat is awful. It's unsustainable. People lose energy. They lose hair. They start to become psychotic. Their mood changes. So there's a whole long story behind the demonization of fat. So it took a long time to read about the history behind why fat was demonized, and that basically scientists were barking up the wrong tree. And then looking into what the real science is, what is behind inflammation, what is actually causing inflammation. So it was a stepwise process, but it like I said, I had to do it for a period of time myself. I had to do the research before I started to prescribe it. And when I realized that the science is sound, the papers are there to show that this is actually the way people should be eating. And not only that, when you have patients that, even in our interventions, when morbidly obese people are put on this diet, or just obese people or overweight people are put on the diet and lose the weight, you can see biomarkers improving. You see the blood pressure coming down. I worked on the other end of the spectrum where my patients were on 5 blood pressure medications, and you didn't know there was no other pill to add. I would be referred, after me is a hypertensive specialist, which is basically a nephrologist here in South Africa. So you can't go, and I know what the nephrologist would say next. So, and now suddenly you have nutrition, and because a reduced carbohydrate diet lowers your insulin, you are now passing excess salts in your urine. So it's a naturally uretic way of eating, which is the way we should be eating. We should be eating sufficient salt to taste, but because of the carbohydrates that we eat that draws salt into the bloodstream, the opposite happens. So when you have putting patients on these diets, so many different biochemical things go on in the body, one of which is that you reduce you pass the sodium in your urine and the blood pressure comes down, and wow, you're reducing antihypertensives. I was never taught that. I was never taught that this would be possible. You're taught step 1, lose weight. So you say to the patient, you need to lose weight. How do I lose weight? Right, you need to see the dietitian. So the patient goes to the dietitian, and the dietitian sits and does an assessment and gives this beautifully formulated plan that says oats and bread and crackers and 1 fruit juice and all of that. And even if the patient diligently follows the diet, inevitably, and this is from anecdotal from my own patients, they would say, I've done it. It's frustrating because I've been so good on this diet, but it is demotivating because I've lost 0.5 kilo in so many months and I'm miserable and I don't have any energy. And then I come to see the doctor and they say, you haven't, you make the patient feel bad for not losing weight. when the diet that you've prescribed is the one that's keeping them stuck and getting them worse.
Mm-hmm. You know, that's really interesting. Recently, I had a similar experience where a client of mine who was diagnosed with diabetes from her A1C and recently diagnosed. She went from pre-diabetic to on metformin and then started my low carb, high fat program. And she saw a dietitian, and the dietitian told her, "Oh no, low carb is bad for you. You shouldn't do it." Da, da, da. And she's like, "So what has your numbers been?" Right. And so when she told her what her numbers been on since she's been on the program, the dietitian then says, "So why were you diagnosed with diabetes?" Right. But then in the same sentence, told her that low fat was not good for her. And I was like, do you hear like how she's conflicting her own statement with your glucose numbers have been so well. And after 6 weeks on the program, she literally cut her A1C she went to the doctor and her A1C was 12 a week before she started. And then 6 weeks later, her A1C was a 6. She literally cut it in half in 6 weeks. But even her doctor is like, "Oh, well, low carb isn't." So what is this resistance in the medical community to actually look at one? There's so much science around low carb, high fat diets that proves that they are both effective of not just treating disease, but literally reversing things like diabetes. But there is this resistance. It's still considered like a fringe diet. What do you think is the source of that resistance, despite the science behind it?
So I firmly believe that all healthcare providers mean well. Most people go into this field truly to help. It's a rigorous training ground. It's really, it's glamorized and all of that, but it's really difficult to practice medicine in the modern world. I think that people are so specialized in their own field. Sorry, can you hear me correctly? Because I'm hearing an echo on my side.
I can hear you now. Yep.
So I think that people, number one, what our training is fat is bad. So I experienced this as well, that when you start to go on your own journey of incorporating more fat in your diet, you literally have to it's a mind shift that fat is not the enemy, but it's your own. You have to train yourself. You have to educate yourself. You have to understand it and then accept it into your life. And so that's the first thing, that what I've experienced at Nutrition Network, we see this because we've trained so many doctors, dietitians, nurses, and so many say, "I developed diabetes. I was obese." So when it affects you, then you're suddenly, it's a real thing. And now, just like Professor Tim Noakes, who developed diabetes and then started to look for how to reverse it or why this happened. So I think when it personally affects you, it becomes something to start really investigating and researching. The other thing is that people are so busy with chronic disease. I've had a lot of people say to me, my own colleagues, that they're so busy in their own area of speciality, reading their own research papers. Papers are being churned out faster than you can process them, that they don't have, this isn't the area that they're passionate about. So why would they read about it? All they do is they read the abstract, and the abstract is something that's sometimes laughable. It talks about a low carbohydrate diet that was not beneficial or even dangerous. And when you read the paper, you see that what the person was put on wasn't even a low carbohydrate diet. The carbohydrates in that diet that they're talking about weren't even restricted. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. And then obviously the fat demonization. People really need to, I think if anybody who's listening is a patient, you need to advocate for yourself. You need to read around, find the YouTube podcasts, and find the articles or find the books and take it to your doctor and say, do the research yourself, because this is the beauty of the modern world. No longer do people have to rely on doctors to just prescribe and sort of direct your health. We have access to all the information. Anybody can do a PubMed search and look for articles and read it. We have Facebook forums where questions can be asked. There's so many really reputable people out there with pages that share the science. There's no, you cannot want for information. So I really feel like people need to know that it's you don't want to demonize the doctor or the dietitian either, because they just don't know yet. Almost like when I was when it was first brought to my attention, my first that LCHF, low carb, high fat, goodness, high fat. How are you gonna is your cereal swimming in cream? I had to figure out what that meant. And then I had to realize what that actually looked like in terms of meals. I think people just don't understand what your meal looks like, what your plate looks like. And they're assuming that you're just glugging down, cream the whole time. So I think the thing is that a lot of people just back down when they hear that professional saying, that's going to kill you. But if you just do a little bit of research yourself and say, actually not, because this paper showed that an LCHF, well-formulated LCHF diet brought down inflammatory markers. These markers came down, your insulin went down. This is what insulin is responsible for in the body. So, I don't actually believe that. And I've had patients say to me, I don't care who tells me to get off this diet, I'm never getting off it because it's given me my life back.
That brings us to a good point. Let's talk a little bit kind of like about the practicality of following a low carb, high fat diet. So in your practice, is diabetes and high blood pressure the main things in which you treat? And what is your percentage of low carb? Do you prescribe a particular percentage of carbs that patients have to follow?
So I'm very individualistic. Because I run an integrative medicine practice, I need to connect with the person coming to me. Sometimes I'll have a person who comes to me who is on a ketogenic diet for 2 years and has reached a stall. And now the level at which I speak to them, they know what insulin is. They have reduced their medication, but they've hit a stall. So the language we speak is very different. And in that case, obviously in that particular patient, it's bio-individualistic therapy. So in that patient, you can see that certain things in the diet need to be removed. Perhaps it's not really also just about the carbohydrates. It's also about the type of fat that you're using, because there are lots of very inflammatory fats, and there's a way to prepare your meals so that you don't create more inflammation in your body. So
what are examples of some of those inflammatory fats?
So things like sunflower oil, people don't realize has a high linoleic acid, and that has been shown to be a potent stimulator of inflammation in the body and really sets up the inflammatory cascade from your actual adipose tissue. So it's complicated, it's interlinked, but when you think about it, it's really simple. We never had to process and heat sunflower seeds to such high temperatures and grow them en masse and use pesticides to make sure that, and to use GMO seeds so that we can get a high yield. We used to be able to just eat the meat, and there's enough fat within that meat muscle to be able to, and eat the eggs and eat the fish and eat the offal and all of those things. And there's enough nutrition in it that you're actually not hungry. And so to get back to your question, it's really individualistic. So I might have a patient whose husband is on a very restricted carbohydrate diet and has done his research and follows all the gurus, LCHF gurus, and says to her, listen, I think you need to give up your bread. And so gets a bit of a health scare and then brings her along to me. Now, this lady, if I were to say to her, right, you need to give this up and that up and that up, I've lost her. So I need to meet her where she's at. And my personal approach is to start with education. So when my patients come, I take, before I meet them, I take a food diary and I send a questionnaire. So I'm trying to figure out who I'm meeting. I try to connect with my patients in terms of what's important to you. What are the reasons? What's your why in life? What's most important to you? So that when I see my patient, I'm if it's a mother, then obviously she wants to be there for her children. And I can relate as a parent. And so I can say to her that, right, so here's your genetic predisposition. It is a loaded gun. I see it, or we talk about it as a loaded gun. You can either pull the trigger or not pull the trigger. And these things are pulling the trigger. It's not just about nutrition. It's about sleep. It's about stress. It's about your marital relations. It's about your community. It's about the passion that you have for your life and your work and all of these things. And nutrition is one big arm of it. So, to make them understand that by making this choice, you are making the choice to pull a trigger. And so you need to be intelligent about whether you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, how frequently you're going to do it. So it's very much an education process about, in your case, you are predisposed to, diabetes or heart disease or Alzheimer's, whatever it is. And so if you just think about, so I take them back and they come to the conclusion by themselves. How old was your dad when he had his first heart attack? How old were your uncles? Or diabetes? How old was your mum when she was diagnosed, and what happened? And then often people have lived through their family's tragedy, and they've seen the amputation and the stroke, and they can say, okay, so my mum was 55 when she had her first admission to hospital. So then I take them a little step further and say, well, when did your mum, do you think, start eating badly, like fast foods and takeaways and things like that? So they'll say, well, probably in her, later. So when did you start? Oh, I started when I was a teenager. So I try to say, you've already put on a lot of inflammation. So you can expect that that's going to start showing up earlier for you. And so, then I show them the insulin cascade, or I show them how insulin works in a picture form. And then I leave it at that. And I say, well, this is what I can suggest. What do you think you can do? So sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but in a person who's diabetic, diagnosed, and they come to me and say, I don't want to be on medication. The answer is, well, then you have to go under 25 grams of carbohydrates. There's no question about that.
Okay. Question: when you have a patient who is diabetic, for example, and they go on low carbs and they reverse their diabetes, do people also reverse any of the side effects? So if someone has been diabetic and they have started having neuropathy or eye or glaucoma or anything, do they also reverse, or are those health side effects or physical side effects permanent once they experience them? So in my medical training, that was irreversible. So those side effects are irreversible. But if you read Dr. Bernstein's book, I don't know if you know of Dr. Bernstein, and he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
in his book, he writes about his own history of how he was a type 1 diabetic. He had developed retinopathy, nephropathy, gastroparesis, which is the paralysis of the nerves in the gut. And he then realized that it had to do with carbohydrates. Long story short is that when he, nobody would believe him. In fact, he actually had to go to medical school to become a doctor to get doctors to listen to him. And he then actually reversed his neuropathy. In Nutrition Network, we've recently done a certification program, and Dr. John Cripps is an emeritus professor in ophthalmology. And his life's work has been to talk about macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy and all the factors. And he talks about the linoleic acid and how it as a major player, not just the carbohydrates. And he mentioned that it was possible to reverse those effects in the eye. So, so it's definitely possible. Anecdotally, at the moment, I haven't really seen any publications of it being done, but this is from highly respected experts in the field, one having personal experience and one seeing it in patients who have been put on an LCHF diet.
Mm-hmm. So the next question I think that people would be really interested in is, for people who do not have diabetes, people who don't have any existing health issues, they're not overweight, should they be eating low carb? Where do whole grains come in, if they come in at all? Like, what is your perspective on healthy people without disease doing a low carb diet?
So it's really simple. I don't even call it a low carb diet. I call it a real food diet, or like Dr. Ken Berry calls it, the proper human diet. You need to think about how much, in my opinion, how much do I value my body? Okay. Then I think about, what does my body need? I prioritize protein. And I know that when I eat a good protein meal, I am satiated much earlier. I eat less for the entire day. I feel more energized. And, so my next meal is quite delayed. I'm not thinking about food. I'm not reaching for snacks. But if I don't, then I am. Even now, if I'm LCHF and if I eat kind of half an egg omelette, like not a half egg, but half the amount that I would have eaten, and I just haven't had the time to finish and eat to satiety, I'll behave differently for the rest of the day. So for me, it's about figuring out what your body needs. And your body needs protein, and your body needs a certain amount of fat to keep it satiated. The amount of fat we think we need is much lower than we really think, because the meats that you're eating, if you're eating like a lot of people eat a carnivore-ish diet, you're actually consuming a lot of fat within that as well.
Right.
So then I think about, if I am going to be diluting the nutrients, so where do I get the best nutrients from? So I mean, that's easy. That's from good quality protein that has good quality fat in it, right? Mm-hmm. So now we know that plants and seeds specifically have anti-nutrients. What we've seen in the LCHF world is we've seen that a lot of people have done this very one-for-one swap. So it hasn't been like a very good mind shift change. They haven't gone eating meat and vegetables. They've gone for normal bread. Okay, let's replace it with low carb bread. Okay, I like muffins. Let me replace it with low carb muffins. And what happens is that we start eating, and I mean, I'm guilty of that as well. You're suddenly eating a whole lot of nuts and seeds that your gut just cannot handle and process that amount that we're suddenly eating. For a few weeks, months, you may feel fine, but in some people, the gut is more susceptible to that type of damage, and people start to struggle after a while.
Mm.
So it's about that. It's about figuring out, where did that food come from? How was it made? How much human interference went into it? Is it genetically modified? Are there glyphosates or insecticides involved in the production? How much processing was there? So I try to eat, and I feed my family food that is processed as little as possible. So if I look at it, if it looks like an egg, then I know it came from a chicken, So I won't buy eggs in a box, and we don't get that anyway in South Africa. But it looks like an egg. It came from a chicken. I try and make sure that the chicken was as free range and healthy as possible. And it's very important to me to make sure that the chicken had a good life, because that energy comes through in the food. And so in my family, our kids, we don't feed them bread, grains at all. If you just look at the nutrition in an egg versus a bowl of oats, you're talking two different things. So
in your family, so your kids eat low carb, they eat no bread, no oats, no. And how old are they, and how long have you been eating that way?
So my son is 6, my daughter is 9. We've pretty much been eating this way for 6 years. I'll tell you one funny thing that happened was when my kids are now homeschooled, but for up until this year, before that, they went to a regular school from the age of sort of 3 or 4. It's a sort of a school that starts with the phases. And because the tradition at that school, which I tried to sort of educate as well, was to have a baker man once a week. And
what's that?
Baker man would mean that a child in the class, a mum bakes a treat, and the child brings it and shares. So once a week on a Friday, the child would bring a cupcake. Usually it was cupcakes. A lot of the time it was store-bought cupcakes. I mean, a lot of the time the mums actually went out of their way to bake the actual cupcakes. And so I would let my daughter eat a cupcake once a week. She was completely clean at home and thought, okay, let me just do this. And lo and behold, within sort of 36 hours.
Oh, I lost you. I lost your audio and you frozen on me. Oh no. And the story was just getting good. We're going to see if Dr. Kajee reconnects. So if you are just tuning in, you are listening to our first Fit Muslimah Podcast interview with Dr. Hassina Kajee, who is an integrative medicine specialist in South Africa. She is a doctor that specializes in low carb therapeutic intervention, which means she uses low carb diet to treat her patients who have diabetes, high blood pressure. She lives a low carb lifestyle herself, as well as her family, including her 2 children who are 6 and 9 years old. You can actually, I want to actually put up Dr. Kajee's contact information. Hopefully she'll be able to log back on. You can actually follow her here on Facebook by going to Hassina Kajee, Carb Free MD on Facebook. You can follow her there. Hopefully she'll be able to reconnect with us and finish telling us a little bit more about how she, as a mom, actually helps her children continue to eat a low carb, healthy lifestyle. I think the things that she was saying really resonates with me, resonates with what I am constantly re-emphasizing to you guys and to my clients, which is it really isn't about low carb or keto being the name of it. It is about eating whole foods, right? As she said, which I absolutely love, which is where is the low fat cows in nature? They don't exist. So why do we feel like we know better than nature by removing fat out of the food? So as I'm often posting, eat whole foods whole. When we look at foods in which has the least amount of human intervention, then we're looking at things that are whole proteins. We are looking at vegetables. We are looking at things that are naturally low in grains and low in carbohydrates. Because if you look at grain products, that has the most intervention from human beings, from the processing of the grains. And the same thing with sugar. If you think of any and everything that has sugar in it, sugar itself is a huge process and processing. Yes, she was able to rejoin us.
Sorry, I have no idea what happened there. I think it was
not a problem. As soon as the story started getting good. You were telling us about your kid's baker's day, and you would allow your daughter to have this one baker's treat once a week, and then what would happen after she had her baker's treat?
Yeah, and so she would just get sick of fever and the runny nose, and it happened, it was just too frequent. And so when we decided to stop that completely, I would actually send her a little bag of treats. I was very lucky to find another mom who was an advocate in this area. Her name is Catherine Barnhorn, and she's the author of Mila's Meals, which is a sugar-free, gluten-free book. Her daughter was in the same class as my daughter, and it was wonderful to have a little community. There were other little kids in the class that were also sugar-free. And so I sent her a little bag of things like dates or nut butters or, date balls or dark chocolate, things that I was happy was a treat that I would give, that somebody else would give. So no processed sugars or processed or oils or inflammatory substances, and that was it. She stopped getting sick, and I tested out. We would go to a birthday party, and actually bags. Obviously, there would be other things they could eat, but usually not really. So I would pack them their little snack bags, and I stopped feeling like the weird mom who took her to the parties, because my kids actually, I didn't that they absolutely loved having.
You were starting to break up again.
Oh.
Okay. I think you're back. I think it's better now.
Something going on at the moment called load shedding, where we get our power cut for sort of 2 hours at a time in various, South Africa. So our reception has started to become affected. And that's even the cell phone towers, because the battery cannot get recharged. And it's a long story.
Okay. But you know what? We are still fortunate that I'm all the way in the United States and you're in South Africa, and we can have a conversation. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? So as we begin to wrap up this interview, could you give our listeners just a little bit of advice on ways in which they can, small steps that they can make in order to begin to take a journey of healing themselves with food?
Sure. Firstly, I want to say that the body is our sort of amana. The body is gifted to us. Our body is what we really need. We take such good care of our children, but we forget that the body was gifted to us to be able to fulfill our purpose on earth. Whatever it is, our purpose, your purpose can be to raise your children. Your purpose can be to be a great builder of houses, or whatever it is that you're doing. Our body is actually the vessel with which we do it. A sound, clear brain requires fuel that doesn't conflict or doesn't confuse the messaging in the brain. And so I want to say that if you know that you're having trouble, you're addicted to a food substance, food addiction is real, then it is really your responsibility to be able to make a plan, to find a way to stop being addicted, because the body is intelligent. It doesn't require a food to ring the bell and say, oh, you have to eat this. It's something that we should be driving our own car, be that with our emotions. If somebody makes us angry, I'm speaking to myself here, try and when you get out of your driver's seat, when you realize somebody irritated you and you reacted in a funny way, a way that's not reflective of who you are, get back into the driver's seat the minute you can and start making those choices again. In the same way with food, it can be a little bit complicated, but if you realize that I don't really the way I feel, it's not about the way I look really. I feel sick, I feel old, my joints are creaky, I'm still young and I really want to improve my health, I want to get better and better. Then remember that Iqra was the first word that was revealed. It's for us to keep reading, keep investigating, figure out what's new out there. The science is evolving. And to just take the steps to say, you don't have to suddenly cut out everything overnight. That's not what I suggest to anybody at all, but you can make small steps. So can I make a note of in one day or in 1 week, how many sugars do you drink? Is that actually good for you? It wastes money. It's bad for your body. You could equally be drinking water, which is better for your health. So can you go from 6 glasses a day to 3 glasses a day to 1 glass a day to eventually giving up that hidden sugar completely, and now you're drinking water, tea or coffee or whatever it is that is unsweetened. If you're drinking 4 teaspoons of sugar, can you go to 3, then 3.5, 3, 2.5? So slowly reduce it, but don't get stuck in a rut where you cannot move to that point. Make a mental commitment to yourself. My message would be really not about nutrition, but really a mental commitment to yourself. What we're all going to die. The question is, how do you want to approach that as age? Do you want to approach it with dignity, or do you want to approach it in a way where there's somebody who actually has to take care of you and has to do those basic functions for you? There's just too many people who in that where they're bedridden, and the children are now having to add that to their responsibilities. So that would be my message, that make that commitment to yourself, figure out what your body needs, take the steps, and keep a journal where you make a commitment and you write down in your journal your intention for today is whatever it is. And then you'll go back to that journal multiple times a day and say, well, my intention is to drink X number of glasses of water. And that is what I would say, that when you make that commitment to yourself, everything starts to fall into place. And you realize we're just being a little bit lazy. If you want to exercise, you can find the time. I mean, with the lockdown and my kids home and having to do everything and work, whatever, I lost the time for my slot. And I realized I have to find a way to just drop in the practice and just do push-ups. I would be outside and just do some wall sits or squats with a resistance band. And you can stretch that out and do it. To be able to do it, but you need to have the commitment to yourself to be able to make those changes.
Absolutely. I agree with everything. The way you summed it up was excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank everybody for listening. You can listen to the Fit Muslimah podcast now on Spotify or iTunes or whatever you like to listen to your podcast. We are going to be streaming live here on Facebook every Thursday. So make sure you tune in live. And if you miss it, you can always catch the archive. Thank you so much for joining us. And inshallah, we will talk to you next week. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum.